A long vellum genealogy lies unrolled under glass, its branches painted in red and gold, each marriage tied to a county, a chapel, a fortress, a debt, a grave. The Habsburg tree is supposed to be one of the best documented in Europe. Names descend in ordered lines, titles attached to land, seals answer to seals. And then, near the hinge point where the family stops being regional lords and starts becoming an imperial machine, a branch enters the record as if it had fallen from the skim. No earlier tomb, no monastery trail, no consistent heraldic past, just a bloodline, suddenly acceptable, suddenly useful, suddenly close enough to marry. In a medieval archive, that is not a small omission. It is a physical contradiction. The official explanation is simple. Records vanish. Border archives burn. Minor houses rise quickly in violent centuries. A family can be obscure in one generation and powerful in the next, especially on the eastern edges of the empire, where jurisdiction overlapped. Names changed with language, and scribes were often writing about places they had never seen. The Habsburgs, after all, built power through marriage. Others fought, they married. They absorbed claims, counties, toll rights, and inheritances with a patience that looked almost mechanical. So the standard answer is that this was merely one more minor line pulled upward by dynastic need, a house too small to matter until it suddenly did. But that answer only works if the gaps behave like ordinary gaps. These do not. Real noble families in medieval Europe rarely appear in only one place. They leak into the record long before they become important. They show up in papal dispensations because cousins wanted permission to marry. They appear in monastic necrologies because someone paid for prayers. They enter feudal registers because land changed hands. They surface in witness lists, arbitration records, tax exemptions, dowry lawsuits, and boundary disputes. Even poor documentation leaves a shape. Here, the shape is wrong. The line does not emerge gradually. It arrives already fitted for dynastic use, carrying a status larger than its paper trail, wealth larger than its territorial footprint, and a pedigree that later copyists seem unusually eager to repair. So the hidden theory is not that a fantasy bloodline descended from nowhere, or that medieval Europe was run by secret magicians. It is narrower than that and more serious. Perhaps the possibility is that the Habsburgs married into a line that was not originally part of the recognized European noble record at all, at least not in the way later genealogists wanted it to appear. A frontier line, a converted line, a commercial line. Perhaps a family whose power began outside the categories medieval chroniclers were trained to preserve, then was recoded as old nobility once its money, access, and strategic value became indispensable. Not a wild conspiracy, an archival conversion, a change in identity carried out through paperwork, marriage law, and institutional convenience. The first clue is documentary density. The Habsburgs themselves can be followed back through overlapping systems. Their lands in the old Aargau region, their castle, their charters, their disputes with abbeys, their ascent through imperial politics, but all of it leaves a layered trail. The same is true of most families they married when the stakes were high. Even houses of only moderate rank usually have earlier witness chains, seals tied to place, and kin networks that can be cross-checked from more than one archive. What matters is not just that one branch is obscure. What matters is that its obscurity is structurally different. The names appear in variant spellings that do not settle quickly. The supposed homeland shifts across later copies. The territorial designation attached to the line looks less like an established seigneurial identity and more like an administrative label applied after the fact. The record is still there. It just does not behave like ancestry, it behaves like insertion. Then there is the money. Dynastic marriages were expensive, but not in a vague ceremonial way. Dowries had to be counted, escorts had to be paid, properties had to be pledged, urban creditors had to be satisfied. Roads, fortresses, and households all reflected the financial consequences of a marriage alliance. In the decades around 1400, Habsburg resources begin to support projects and negotiations that seem larger than their cleanly documented inheritance stream would suggest. That does not mean the treasury was mysterious. It means the timing is awkward. Capital appears near the same moment this poorly documented line becomes relevant. Alpine transit corridors become more aggressively monetized. Administrative handling becomes sharper. Toll infrastructure matters more. Retainers can be maintained more reliably. This is what money does in the archive. It changes tempo. If the line was truly a modest noble house from a forgotten valley, why does its arrival correspond less with new land than with new liquidity? A fair objection is that frontier Europe really was patchy. In regions exposed to war, migration, or shifting sovereignty, families could rise with little paperwork surviving behind them. Entire runs of charters have been lost. Monastic archives were dispersed. Castles changed names. Scribes Latinized, Germanized, Magyarized, or Slavized the same person differently in different decades. All of that is true, and any honest investigation has to admit it. But even generous allowance for archival loss does not explain the social smoothness of the transition. Obscure houses do not usually enter elite marriage networks without resistance. Questions are asked, kinship is examined, claims are challenged. The closer a line moves toward the center of dynastic strategy, the more scrutiny it normally receives. Here, the scrutiny seems to have been satisfied unusually fast, as if status was being recognized for reasons other than a long, noble memory. That raises the next clue, the character of the wealth itself. Landed nobility tends to leave one kind of financial fingerprint. Income arrives through rents, dues, mills, tolls, mines, court rights. It is slow, local, and tied to place. Merchant or diaspora capital looks different. It is mobile. It moves through credit, partnership, pledges, transport, and access to routes rather than fields. In late medieval Europe, some of the least visible wealth in the noble archive belonged to families whose real power came from trade networks stretching through the Adriatic, the Black Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the overland corridors touching the Balkans and beyond. Such families could be rich without appearing old in the feudal sense. They could matter intensely to a dynasty that controlled passes, rivers, toll stations, and border markets. What changed was the explanation. Money that could not easily be admitted as commercial could be made marriageable by converting it into lineage. Look at the map, and the theory becomes less strange. The Habsburg position was never only about castles, it was about corridors. Control of Austrian lands and Tyrolean routes meant access to movement. Silver, cloth, salt, grain, armed men, diplomatic traffic, news. A dynasty sitting on transit points had every incentive to attract people who understood how movement became revenue. That does not require a secret empire. It requires competence. Families rooted in cross-border commerce or in regions where Latin Christendom met Byzantine, steppe, Balkan, or Mediterranean systems often carried exactly that competence. Yet those families were difficult to classify inside Western aristocratic genealogy. Their language, rite, legal tradition, or origin story might not fit the paper habits of imperial or papal record keepers. If such a line entered Habsburg marriage politics, the easiest long-term solution would be to translate it into familiar noble terms and let later historians mistake the translation for the truth. The pattern widens when the scale changes. This is not only about one marriage. Late medieval Europe repeatedly absorbed people before it fully named them. Banking families became indispensable to crowns that still pretended land alone generated power. Military entrepreneurs were ennobled after the fact. Converts received new coats of arms. Refugee elites from collapsing states were reclassified as local nobility within a generation or two. Imperial service itself could manufacture ancestry by rewarding function with title, then asking scribes to provide a more dignified past. The Habsburgs were not unique in using this mechanism. They were simply better at hiding it beneath a language of continuity. By the 16th century, everyone sees the money behind the throne in the form of financiers and contracted credit. Earlier than that, the same process is harder to spot because it often entered through kinship. The pattern does not disappear, it only becomes more legible later. One of the strangest details in cases like this is retrospective pedigree. When a line truly has an old history, later genealogists usually preserve fragments, contradictions, awkward names, and local oddities because that is how real memory survives. Fabricated or heavily repaired ancestry tends to look smoother. It backfills too neatly. It discovers convenient ancestors at the exact moments legitimacy is needed most. It introduces coats of arms that align beautifully with later politics. It explains rather than remembers. In Habsburg-adjacent documentation from the 15th century, there are places where the repair work feels visible. A family that had been thinly attested becomes easier to describe once the marriage has already done its work. Origins harden. Heraldry stabilizes. Geography becomes less ambiguous. Bounce, that is not proof of fraud by itself, but it is exactly what bureaucratic normalization looks like when a useful line has to be given a past equal to its new rank. And this is where the story becomes less dramatic and more unsettling. The truth may not have been hidden by anyone meeting in candlelit rooms to erase history. It may have been hidden by categories, by canon law that cared more about marital eligibility than ethnographic precision, by imperial clerks who needed a legal identity they could enter into a register, by later genealogists who preferred clean descent over messy transition, by dynasties that wanted commercial power without the social embarrassment of admitting dependence on non-noble capital, and by historians trained to read noble archives as if they reflected the full structure of power rather than the respectable surface of it. Bureaucracy is excellent at making an accommodation disappear once it has been regularized. The stone remembers, the paper often does not. What remains, then, is not a solved mystery but a sharper frame. A family central to European power may have entered the Habsburg orbit from outside the recognized noble memory of Europe, then been translated into that memory so successfully that the translation replaced the event. The official explanation of archival loss can absorb part of the anomaly, but not all of it. The missing early references matter. The strange timing matters. The scale of capital matters. The later smoothing of identity matters. And the broader historical pattern matters most of all. Now, Europe's ruling houses did not grow only by inheritance and war. They grew by absorbing skills, roots, and money from people the old categories could not comfortably describe. Once absorbed, those people were often renamed as ancestry. Seen that way, the question is no longer whether one Habsburg marriage linked to a bloodline with no visible European past before 1400. The question is what the absence itself was protecting: a noble fiction, a frontier origin, a commercial network, a conversion no later historian wanted to emphasize. The deeper unease comes from how plausible all of those possibilities are. In a century of collapsing borders, monetized roots, displaced elites, and legal improvisation, the sudden appearance of a marriageable bloodline is not impossible at all, and it may be exactly what power looks like when it is changing form faster than the archive can admit. And that leaves the most uncomfortable reframing of all. Perhaps the Habsburgs did not merely marry for territory, or even for prestige. Perhaps at a critical moment, they married for access to a system of wealth and knowledge that could not yet be stated openly in aristocratic terms. The bloodline looked ancient later because the alliance had become permanent. The record looked continuous later because discontinuity had been repaired. What appeared to be genealogy may have been infrastructure in human form, not a fairy tale, a merger. The real question is not whether the theory sounds strange, but whether anyone with the tools to verify it has seriously looked.